Okay, let's make a start. Um, Welcome everyone to today's Monday Majlis. It's a pleasure to um, welcome Professor Cyrus Zargar, an old friend, to this conversation. Um, and Cyrus holds the Al-Ghazali Distinguished Chair at Central Florida University, I believe. That's
University of
correct.
Central Florida.
University of Central Florida, yeah. And he's well known as a specialist on Sufism and he's written extensive in ethics as well. Um, we will be talking about one of his new books, Religion of Love, on ʿAṭṭār. But before we start that conversation, and before Cyrus presents on that book, we'll do what we normally do, which is ask him a few questions about his journey, if he has any advice for our students, and how he came to write the book. So, if I start off again, welcome Cyrus, and if I can just ask you a bit about your intellectual journey, how did you get to where you are?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for asking. And thanks for inviting me here. Yeah, I was I was really drawn to English literature as an undergraduate, and it was in my third year that I actually started to study Arabic. Third year as an undergraduate. Before that, I was just doing English. I was working on a Latin minor, and then at a certain point in the classics department where I was doing my minor, they said, the professor said, okay, well, now you've done a lot of Latin, you should move on to Greek. And I remember saying to him, I said, I really want to try Arabic, so I don't think I'm going to have time for Greek. And as I started to study Arabic, and then Persian as well, I just found what I was reading in Persian literature, at first in translation and in Arabic literature, um, was, it had a certain kind of like dimension to it and richness to it that I wasn't finding in the English literature. It was answering certain questions. It was addressing certain concerns that I just wasn't finding, in the English literature that I was studying. And so, I decided to do what I thought at the time was going to be comparative literature um, as a graduate student, but in a Near Eastern Studies program. And the reason why I wanted to do comparative literature in a Near Eastern Studies program was because I figured that it's better to become a specialist, to learn the language as well. But over the course of studying comparative literature, it sort of morphed into something more like literature in Islamic studies, because I realized that the tools that I needed to read Ibn al-Farid or Rumi, or in case of today's talk, ʿAṭṭār, the tools that I needed were an understanding of the intellectual history, as well as the philosophical background, the theological background, and it all ended up, the toolkit ended up adding up to Islamic studies, but it was always for the sake of literature for me.
Yeah, yeah, and that of course I guess led to your dissertation and your first book, which was
Yeah,
very much a study of literature, but within a particular kind of Sufi context, right?
exactly.
And
Yes,
Arabic and Persian, if I remember
that's
correctly.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, in terms of how you went on from there, I mean, well, actually, no. If we just reflect on your graduate days, because
Yeah.
usually the graduate days and also experience of advising graduate students. That should have brought up certain ideas about what advice you would give to people, because we always ask our guests to do precisely this because we have, as you know, a number of PhD students, including ones on the call, and it's always interesting for them to hear the reflections of colleagues about what pieces of advice would they give to them about the process of doing a PhD and what they should remember to do and what they should perhaps not bother doing.
Yeah, that's that's true. Um, so the one thing I remember was the sort of the generation, I would say before ours, and I think this is probably true for your advisors as well. They didn't publish much until they were done with their PhD. And very often, they would actually back then, this is the generation before ours, get jobs uh, before having published anything at all. Maybe that wasn't uncommon for people being hired in the let's say the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. But what's happening is there's this sort of culture of productivity and output that I think is pretty unfortunate
Yeah.
because the beauty of that time is it's a time to study and read. And I guess my first bit of advice would be preserve that as much as you can. Of course, everyone wants to be marketable, and you, you're going to need some articles published to get a first job. But at the same time, I would say it's there's really nothing like those years in graduate school, unencumbered by expectations to publish, where you're actually reading for reading's sake and learning for learning's sake. That would be my first bit of advice. Is just to enjoy that and do that as best you can. My second bit of advice is more general, which is um, just looking at the state of you know higher ed humanities jobs, at least here in America. Um, it's not worth getting into it unless you're studying what you love. And
Yeah.
so you'll often hear people tell you that you should be reading this and you should be reading that, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. At the end of the day, if you don't love what you're studying, um, why do it? You might as well get a law degree, go to medical school, do something. If you're in this and you're rolling the dice on having a humanity a high PhD in the humanities, you might as well just really get into something you love. Now that tends to be true for most graduate students, but I think the more you find what you love, actually, the better of a scholar that will make you. So,
And I think that's very true, especially since so many colleagues think this might be the last generation where we still have humanities in a university.
yeah,
So
yeah,
uh,
it's a
it,
worry, isn't it?
it
Yeah.
is. I mean, it's strange. Obviously, it's much more disturbing what's happening in the US, but you can see kind of glimpses of it everywhere across Europe as well, and perhaps more in the UK than in other parts of Europe. This a massive kind of revival of this notion that, well, the humanities are just a hobby. So
Hmm.
why would you be paid to do it in the setting of a university, and that sort of a move towards much greater instrumentalization. So
Hmm.
that is,
Exactly.
yeah. Um, okay, well, let's move on then to yeah. So how did you come to write this particular book? After the previous work you've done, what brought you to this particular book on art?
Yeah. So in my second book, The Polished Mirror, there's the ninth chapter, or no, I think yes, it's the ninth chapter, I think, and I deal with ʿAṭṭār there, and so I had been working a little bit on ʿAṭṭār, and when I was thinking about a next project, what struck me about ʿAṭṭār is he works so well in translation. So it's a joy to read Rumi, to read Maulana. It's a joy and a pleasure. And his ghazals work beautifully, beautifully in translation. I mean, you can just look at the work of Coleman Barks. I mean, they're sometimes far from the text, but that's okay. Um, but the Masnavi is in parts at least a text that's meant for students, for Rumi students who know enough about, let's say, Islamic theology and Islamic law and the issues in the Masnavi to appreciate, um, you know, the detail, the level of detail there. You can tell Attar's audience in the poems that I study is different. Um, Certainly they know enough about Islam to get into some detail. But the larger sort of thematic issues in Sufism are what interests him more. And I think that, again, reflects his audience and who he is. That it's a group of non-specialists who are very interested in Islamic learning, particularly in the Sufi tradition. And so because of that, it gave me this opportunity to translate in a way that I think can convey, the teachings of the time, themes that are common between him, Rumi, and other Sufi poets, but in a way that works really well in translation.
Yeah.
So that was kind of that's what started it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that accessibility is very important. I mean, it's interesting that I guess especially with Mantiq al-Tayr, there's so many translations, right?
It
Uh,
is, yeah, it works so well.
and
Yeah.
I mean, I think pretty much all of us at some point have used some story I mean, with me, it's always the Sheikh San'an story
Hmm.
for teaching, just because it's very accessible uh, yeah, I mean, it's the Dick Davis translation in my case, but it is it is um, it is one text which is widely used in teaching and translation. But I wonder, I mean, before we kind of continue, what are the other kind of works of ʿAṭṭār that you feel really ought to have been translated and haven't been? Because I think it does seem to me that it's primarily the Mantiq al which is available
Hmm.
in translation.
Yeah.
What are the ones which are kind of neglected? I sometimes always feel that I quite like the Musibat Name.
Well,
Uh,
that's the one I was going to mention.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm surprised that no one's actually translated it. Or
Yeah, I
critically.
well, I know of I met a young student who has translated. He just hasn't published it. But yeah, I agree. I'm surprised. Um, it wouldn't be a difficult book to translate. I mean, it's as you said, accessible as the Mantiqater. Um, it's a beautiful, beautiful text.
Yeah,
So my first choice would be yes, the Musibat Name. Then I guess if I had to have another one, it would be the Asrar Name,
right.
which is also, I mean, it's very nice, and it doesn't have that framing narrative structure. But I actually think the way most people read these texts, that's probably for the better.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, the Musibat Name is underappreciated. It in a way it's his most psychologically profound. I mean, like Ilm Nafs kind of delving
yeah,
into the soul and the journey of the soul. It's his most profound. Um, and then also the stories in it. Some of them, the sort of micro narratives, are I mean, just excellent, really enlightening, tied together in a frame that in some ways. I think he holds to more than the mental Qatar. I mean, the mental Qatar frame is beautiful and it has that wonderful ending, but he's much more consistently tapping into the frame throughout the Musibat Name. So yeah,
well, we could easily kind of continue this for ages and kind of broadly ask questions about literature and Sufism, but I think we should focus now on your book.
oh,
So
sure,
if we now continue with your presentation on the book, and I'm sure there will be many questions which will arise from it. So please
sure.
do
Yeah, I'll
go
get started.
ahead with your
Yeah, okay. So, as I mentioned, um, this book, um, you know, began because of an interest in Attar's view of the world. Um, so, one of the things that I began to study when I was researching this book was the climate in Nishapur, where where Attar grew up, where he lived, and it's difficult not to notice that Ibn Sina really affected basically the entire trajectory of intellectual thought after himself, as you know. Um, so it, you know, from the theologians, the mutakallimin, to the Sufis, of course, philosophy, we need not say anything at all. That was permanently altered. The faith, this philosophy, I would say, you know, in the West, but especially in Arabic. Um, and one of the main branches of knowledge that I see Ibn Sina appear in when it comes to Sufism is in ilm nafs, in psychology. Um, uh, that's almost where he's inescapable. His discussion of the inner senses, his interest in, you know, perceiving, you know, meaning. Um, all of this makes its way into Islamic writings. And ʿAṭṭār is responding in a way, I think, to what he saw as a kind of crisis. Some of it he's picking up from Ghazali. Now, I can't get into the whole debate right here as to, well, what did Ghazali really believe? But Ghazali is a person, and also Ghazali is a body of writing, his works that live on after him, especially in Persian. There are some works attributed to him, like Tuhfatul Muluk, that we know ʿAṭṭār read for sure. But the body of writing of Ghazali is, of course, what matters, not what he thought, because that body of writing influenced thinkers like ʿAṭṭār and others. Their reactions to philosophy, I mean, are so in line with Ghazali's arguments that it can't just be coincidental, especially since, as I mentioned in the book, ʿAṭṭār, you know, references Ghazali on at least one occasion. So, here. Um, you know, this quote at the top, I came across it recently in a beautiful article on Rumi by Fatima Keshavarz, and it got me thinking. So this is from Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And what it made me think about is, well, Horatio is a student at the university, and philosophy here probably means natural philosophy. Um, the quote made me think about how similar the plight of people like ʔAṭṭār was throughout what we could call the medieval world. Now, I've seen some call the medieval world in the Islamic context as post-classical, but I feel comfortable saying medieval here because there is a common response to a certain kind of philosophy, a philosophy that makes a claim to knowledge about the universe, from the natural to, as I said, psychology, to metaphysics, and presents it as one system that can be argued about by human beings, right? And Shakespeare, in this scene where Horatio's seen a ghost, reported it to Hamlet, he gives us this couplet, these two lines that I think get to the crux of the matter, which is that when you see a ghost, right, it undoes your understanding of the natural world. I mean, you could very well put science here, right, in the modern perspective, that there are some ways of explaining the universe that are meant to be accepted. They make big claims, and there almost seems to be no way out of them. And I think, in a sense, that ʔAṭṭār, like many thinkers in his time who belong to a way of thinking that claims something beyond the rational, I think that he's responding articulately and intentionally to that in his poetry. So these lines I've translated, and actually they're not in the book. These lines I've translated as sort of being the crux of what I talk about in the book. Okay, it has the three major themes that I discuss more or less in the book. It comes from the Mantiqater, from the speech of the birds, and it's toward the very end, toward the conclusion. ʿAṭṭār says, for the Seymour, a person has only created the proper elixir once they have mastered the language of these birds. When will you ever recognize the prosperity of the spiritually endowed ones, Dawlat Ruhaniyan? When will you ever recognize the prosperity of the spiritually endowed ones amongst the hikmat, amongst the philosophy of the Greeks? In other words, how can you ever recognize what the spiritual ones have, this prosperity, this fortune, this success that they have, if you're stuck with the philosophy of the Greeks? Without divorcing yourself from that hikmat, when will you ever become a man in the hikmat of religion? So it's important here. That's why I haven't translated hikmat, is because there's a tension there. If you want the hikmat of deen, then how will you ever become a man? That's interesting. He says that, right? That for him, the image of the man standing up for the truth. This is something important in ʿAṭṭār's poetry, which we'll get to. How will you ever achieve that while here you are stuck in this way of thinking that he's calling Greek? Anyone who mentions its name on the path of love has no awareness of love in the register of religion. Again, deen. So the three themes that I'm mentioning, and I'll show you on the next slide. The three themes that hold the book together are deen, religion, love, ishq, and union. So what you see in this passage is an absolute proclamation that there is some contradiction between trying to make your way somewhere using this hikmat of the Greeks, which, as we know from other passages of ʿAṭṭār, the problem with it is that you're asserting yourself, you're looking at divisions in the world, you're looking at variety, you're looking at the human way of thinking, which involves comparison, contrast, multiplicity, trying to make some kind of progress that all the while is actually making you worse at perceiving union. Why? Because it has an ethical effect. I'll get to that. When what you actually need is this elixir, that elixir being love, this path of love, that undoes a sense of selfhood, that undoes multiplicity, that throws you into the metaphor used in the Musibatnama is this ocean, to this ocean of oneness. And that's when you realize the actual crux or core of the message in the deen, in the religion, in what Muhammad has brought, right? That's really, I mean, if you think about it, by ending the mental ʿAṭṭār with this message, this is part of the ending. I mean, ʿAṭṭār is saying something really clear about religion. And so I think it's fascinating that up until this point, no one has studied ʿAṭṭār as, in the English language, as a thinker about religion, as I wouldn't call him a philosopher of religion, but as someone who has something to say about the place of religion in the world, and how it should be interpreted and how it should be practiced. Whereas I think actually that's his main goal in writing these poems. So, as I said, the structure of the book is it has an introductory section where I talk about the setting. Who is ʿAṭṭār? As best we know, and it's difficult to know who ʿAṭṭār is because we don't have reports of him at the time. Some come later, which are legendary, but still useful. I studied the climate in which he worked and lived and wrote, which was one of really desperate times. Nishapur, of course, comes to this horrible conclusion at the end of his life. We know how when he died, because he dies at the hands of the Mongols during the Mongol invasions that leave basically everyone dead except for a number of hundreds of craftsmen. That's what the report is. But even before that, The city had been razed to the ground, because of the other invasions, sectarian conflict between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is, and really trying times. They were really trying times for ʿAṭṭār, his family, and others who lived in Nishapur. So the first part is thinking about the climate, who he is, why is he writing. I give an outline of what we know to be his established works, his writings. And then the rest of the book is divided into these three parts: religion, love, and union, with very short chapters, relatively short chapters, informing each of those three parts. So let's return then to this problem. And I take this from this text, the Mi'rajnameh. Why? Because this idea, whether this text was actually by Ibn Sina or not, and I would love, Sajjad, to hear your thoughts on this, whether this text was by him or not, it's one of many that takes Ibn Sina's ideas, whether by him or someone else, and applies them to traditional Islamic sources. Here, a hadith about the Prophet's Mi'raj, right? And you can see the way that Ibn Sina's psychology can begin to overpower other ways of reading this event of the Prophet meeting God, and really anything that has to do with the soul and its progress. So the passage from the hadith is reported from the Prophet: from being in awe of God, I forgot everything that I had seen and known. Such unveiling grandeur and pleasure from proximity was produced that you would say that I was intoxicated, right? This is a description of being in touch with God. Now, the author of this text it rephrases the words and interprets them as follows: I was no longer engaged in perceiving and preserving particulars. The rational soul achieved so much pleasure from this knowledge that all the faculties of the natural and animal soul stopped working. I was so immersed in unity that I was no longer engaged in the world of substances and bodies, right? Again, this kind of reading will have a major effect on intellectuals, courtly writers, all those who are interested in issues relating to the soul, metaphysics, will be influenced by this, especially the poet Sana'i. Sana'i has a long narrative poem, relatively long, not as long as the Musibatnameh, that directly influences ʿAṭṭār's Musibatnameh. And you can see in it that there's a tremendous influence of Ibn Sina that's now making its way to ʿAṭṭār, because ʿAṭṭār will be directly influenced by Sana'i. And then, of course, Rumi will be influenced by ʿAṭṭār. And if you look at the narrative, it begins with all of the things that you'll see in Ibn Sina's Hay ibn Yaqdhan about the soul, as well as his model of the senses, including the active intellect appears in this. But Sana'i is very careful to have the story take a turn before the end, where the person seeking, this ultimate reality is taken by a new guide who's a Hanafi scholar that was probably Sana'i's patron. And Sana'i is very careful to praise this person and mention that this person, Ibn Mansur, has a kind of knowledge that isn't attainable through rational means, that it's something beyond the rational that this man has, that there is a kind of love waiting for a person who's willing to not be bound by intellect, by what they call intellect. And what you're going to see is that in these writings, these later Persian Sufi influenced writings, intellect often doesn't have the same sense of what the nous, or that you'll see in Ibn Sina. This kind of, I mean, intellect for Ibn Sina is one thing, and the way they're reading Ibn Sina is something else. They're reading it as a faculty very often. So when we get to ʿAṭṭār's reading of Sana'i, and that's where the Musibat Nama is so important. ʿAṭṭār is very clear that he is writing his own spiritual journey narrative in response to the problems in his day, the confusion in his day. He says everywhere that he looked, people were diseased by the effects of causes, meaning they were so busy using reasoning to try to figure things out that they couldn't look at things behind the curtain. Of course, part of his frustrations, and he even mentions the problem of sectarianism in the poem, have to do with the Hanafi Shafi'i, hostility that wrecked this. That I mean, had a huge effect. In fact, the whole section of the ʿAṭṭār, those who had apothecaries, those who were doing druggists like him, they had a whole section of town. It was all burned down. So probably ʿAṭṭār's family business at one point was burned down, and actually not because of this, but because of a later the Oghuz Turks invading the city. They actually had to move the entire city, rebuild the entire city somewhere else. But for the hostility between these legal schools to be so violent, obviously affected ʿAṭṭār. One way you see it affect him, by the way, is that in ʿAṭṭār's poems, he's careful not to let you know which madhab he belongs to. I mean, it seems sort of clear that I think that there's some indication that he was Shafi'i, but he's very balanced because it's a sensitive topic. So he mentions the logicians who use trickery. He mentions philosophers, and usually the sophists will come afterwards. But those who are not interested in true wisdom, but rather interested more in negating received revealed knowledge. He mentions astronomers, legalists, Sufis, ascetics, devoted worshippers, all led astray. And that's what all of this setting is, what leads his salik, the wayfarer, to try to seek out the truth throughout the universe, and then finally within himself. So again, this is a major theme in ʿAṭṭār's poetry. Now, in this one, in Musibat Nameh, it's presented as a wayfarer trying to seek the truth. In the Mantiq al-Tair, it's presented as birds, a series of birds going to seek the Simorgh. Again, both are journey narratives, both probably influenced by the Mi'raj narratives, as well as a bird story that made its way from Ibn Sina, and then Ghazali, and then translated by Ghazali's brother. But ʿAṭṭār's response to this, very often in many texts, is on the first level that a person can achieve knowledge of the real, awareness with the real, and connection with the real simply by embracing Islam, religion, in its simplest form, in its most basic form, if that is done with sincerity. The phrase that he uses, you'll see quoted by other scholars from Nishapur, or that area, Eastern Iran, in that time. So you can see that it was an idea that was current. And it is this Din al-Ajaiz, the religion of old women, meaning the religion that's practiced by those who, in society at that time, in the 12th and 13th centuries, those who were not trained, sometimes were not literate, there's stories of, elderly women, they were asking him, well, where is God? God is up there. Or the famous uh, story of Fakhr Razi and someone saying to an elderly woman as Fakhr Razi came into town, well, don't you know who that is? Why aren't you standing up for him? That's Fakhr Razi. He's the man who has 100 proofs of God. And then the old woman responds, well, if he has 100 proofs, it's only because he had 100 doubts. That kind of certainty that comes from a simple, love-based, sincere view of God, that's an important part of ʿAṭṭār's poetry and his prose. And in fact, his prose work, the Tazkiratul Awliya, has an account that's celebrated for good reason, the Count of Rabia, where this comes from. Rabia is the finest example of someone who epitomizes the Din al-Ajaiz, the religion of old women, which you can't dismiss as something that's just simplistic. It's not. There's a deeper knowledge in it that transcends the kind of knowledge that learned people have. So you can see it here. After she had died, Rabia, someone saw her in a dream. They said, well, how did you do with those frightening angels of the grave, the two angels who, Munkir and Nakir, who interrogate people in the grave? And her reply shows how unfazed she is because of her personal relationship with God. When those two fine young men came and asked, who is your Lord? I said, you go back and tell God, my God, you never forgot a weak old woman among a million of your creatures in this whole wild world. I have no one but you, so how could I forget you for you to send someone else to ask who is your Lord, right? She's offended that she would even be asked this question. And that works for her. That works for her because she doesn't need to have some profoundly theological response. Her response comes from the heart. And that's what makes Rabia successful. That's what makes her a saint, one of the awliya. And this is a common theme in ʿAṭṭār's writings. Sometimes it's with the old woman, and sometimes it's with the madman's version of the religion. The finest example of someone who embodies religion, love, and union is ʿAṭṭār's hero, Hallaj. Hallaj is more than just ʿAṭṭār's hero. The poet Jami, in his account of the Sufi saints, where he mentions ʿAṭṭār, he conjectures that ʿAṭṭār actually was initiated into the path through an Owaisi connection from Hallaj. That's how closely bound ʿAṭṭār is to Hallaj. Of course, if ʿAṭṭār was affiliated with the line coming from Al-Ghazali, that too would explain the interest in Hallaj, because that is common for the followers of Al-Ghazali. But if you look at this account, this is translated by Arbery, this account of Hallaj from the Tazkiratul Awliya, pay attention to the theme, I would say, of religion in it. Because the theme of love and union, I think, is apparent in the story of Hallaj. Hallaj famously said, right, Ana al-Haq, I am the real. That's a version of union. That's his expression of fana, though some accused him of hulul, being incarnation. Regardless, that's the saint speaking about his experience of being annihilated in the real. That part's apparent. That's why he's being executed. Love, again, he's annihilated in the love of God, and you'll see love in everything that Hallaj says. But look at the theme of religion. I think you'll really see what ʿAṭṭār's message is. When they brought him, Hallaj, to the base of the gallows at Bab al-Taq, which is in Baghdad, he kissed the wood and set his foot upon the ladder. How do you feel? They taunted him. He answered, the ascension of true men is the top of the gallows. He was wearing a loincloth about his middle and a mantle on his shoulders. Turning toward Mecca, he lifted up his hands and communed with God. What he knows, no man knows, he said. Then he climbed the gibbet. What do you say? Asked a group of his followers. concerning us who are your disciples, and these who condemn you and would stone you. They have a double reward, and you a single, he answered. You merely think well of me. They are moved by the strength of their belief in one God to maintain the rigor of the law. Again, I'll read that last part. They are moved by the strength of their belief in one God to maintain the rigor of the law. Look at what now ʿAṭṭār is telling us this ultimately. He's reporting it. He's collected these reports about Hallaj, and he's giving it to us in a really moving depiction of Hallaj, one that in many editions of the Tazkiratul Awliya is not just the climax, but the end of the text. So some texts go on with more saints after this. Some of them end on this. Look at what he's saying. It is very important for the belief in one God and the rigor of the law to be maintained, even when the creme de la creme of the saints will realize something that could undo that. That is kufr tariqat, the disbelief of the kind of belief in God that is considered disbelief by the generality of the people. You need both to exist. Not in the sense of what, let's say, Farabi is saying, where you have like, certain achieved philosophers and the rest of the people are kind of like they're in service to the philosophers. No. Rather, each of these levels of belief actually supports the other. It works as a whole. The beauty of sincerity in what you can call the simple, those who observe the law, they do so in a way that we might call somewhat even, literal. That informs and allows for the saint to say things that are contradictory and to go beyond it, but exist within that universe. You need both, right? And in a proper context, they're informing one another, right? The saint should be loved, but actually for ʿAṭṭār, the saint's position is magnified when he's hated. There's nothing better for ʿAṭṭār than to be a lover of God who's hated for others because of that love. It purifies the love of the saint because it's more sincere that way. You're not doing it for the praise of others. Again, we see these major themes in ʿAṭṭār's poetry, but in condensed form here. I'll show you actually some of his poetry here in the next one. So this comes from the Asrar-Nameh. Sometimes with the scoundrels, we were in the tavern. Sometimes we rubbed our faces on the door of the idol temple. Sometimes we fastened the zunar girdle around our waists. Sometimes we seated ourselves inside the monastery. Sometimes among hostile disbelievers, we were at war. Sometimes along with fire, we were lodged in stone. Sometimes we threw our prayer rugs over our shoulders. Sometimes in the heart's vast ocean, we boiled. Again, there's a plurality here that's necessary. The arif, the knower, can embody all of them within himself. Within himself, there is both kufr and iman. There's both, deen and kufr. They're both there, right? In fact, the recognizer can in some ways embrace disbelief because it enhances their relationship with God. But at the same time, at the heart of all of these is love. Love is what draws the person into multiple directions or into this kind of multiplicity, seeking God's face in each of the places each of the instances where he's manifest, which is in all of these things. And ultimately, love is able to create that fire. He compares the arif, the knower, the recognizer, to a stone, a cold stone, that when you strike it, fire comes out. It's struck by love, and fire comes out. And the fire has, of course, a purifying effect and an awakening effect, and an effect ultimately to bring the person to completely undo themselves in God. And here we are at my my last slide where I'll conclude. So when I say that ʿAṭṭār is responding to an intellectual crisis, where the answer doesn't exist among the fuqaha, among those who are studying law, the answer doesn't exist among the mutakallimin, those who are arguing to assert their position in polemical ways. It definitely doesn't belong to the philosopher, because the philosopher is bringing something outside of revelation. And so for him, it doesn't have any bearing on God's own communication with human beings. He does give us what real knowledge is. And he does this in the Mental ʿAṭṭār, and he does it in the Musibat-Nama and elsewhere, Asrar-Nama as well. And he calls that often jami'iyat. So the problem with rational knowledge is a problem with all false forms of knowledge. And that's twofold. First, the first problem is that rational knowledge, as I said at the beginning of my talk, relies on distinctions and forms, multiplicity. You acquire those within the soul, and something comes out of that. It relies on there being a you and then an object of study. And and now we get to and that's not has nothing to do with reality or the truth, because the reality and truth is unity. Okay. Now the second problem is also related to this. Because you in rational knowledge are studying these things, when you learn, it's inflating your ego, and also it's establishing that you are separate from things. So the effect of rational knowledge, and in fact many of these other kinds of knowledge, is that it ethically takes you farther from your goal. It makes you more. It actually creates a bigger idol that you'll need to actually smash. Smashing that idol at a certain point of study becomes impossible because it's so huge. It's so tremendous. Real knowledge smashes the idol. Real knowledge undoes differences, discriminations. It undoes multiplicity. It is the jumping into the sea of the spirit that's described in the Musibat-Nameh. It is the looking in the mirror of of selfhood, where the 30 birds see themselves, and they are the 30 birds. The Simorgh are the Simorgh, as you see in the Mental ʔaṭṭār. These kinds of bringing things together, that is real knowledge. Union, in other words, is real knowledge. So this is ultimately ʔaṭṭār's message throughout his poetry, that being both his ghazals and his narrative poems, and even we see it in the Tazkiratul Awliya, his prose text. So with that, I think that's good. I'll stop sharing. I'll try to keep it short so we can have more time for Q&A.
No, that was really good. That was great. In fact,
Thank you.
really brought up a lot of very important questions and themes. Not least because I like the fact that you started with the Mi'raj-Nameh, because it takes us to one of the fundamental polemics in our field, which is, what is the real nature of Avicenna's kind of whole approach to things, and what is his relationship with Sufism as well, which I think is a really important question. Yeah, so love, no, religion, love, union, the three parts and the three themes that you emphasized, which were really interesting. Just one comment about the Mi'raj-Nameh, and then one comment about true knowledge is undifferentiated. So I know this sounds a bit unfair, but sometimes one often thinks of Neoplatonism when you're thinking of these sorts of themes, just because. So, for example, the Mi'raj-Nameh and the way in which, so whether it's Ibn Sina himself who wrote it, or whether it's someone who was a follower of his, I don't think is that important. I think it actually definitely does represent Avicennian doctrine. I think that's very clear to me. But the way in which this is described, of course, reminds me of, perhaps the paradigmatic scene from Plotinus and Aeneas about the ecstasy of the soul which has left the body and arrived in the presence of the one, and experiences ecstasy and experiences wonder and is and light, um, and and a complete sense of union and an absence of any differentiation. So that that particular account, which of course comes through the Uthulugia into Arabic, is so prevalent everywhere. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Avicenna himself, although Avicenna in his comments on that passage is a bit, he questions whether it could be Aristotle, but interestingly, that's a different kind of question about whether he thinks it's Aristotle or not. But clearly, it is something which is significant for him because he comes back to it, for example, in the Isharat,
Mm-hmm.
especially in his notions of the Arif and what is the Arif, as opposed to the Abid, and the one who knows. Um, so in that sense, I mean, there's clear continuities of that particular theme in Neoplatonism. And then, of course, something else which does come up in the Orthologia, which is derived from Plotinus, is this notion of the simple intellect, or proper knowledge. Proper knowledge is all at once, simultaneous, undifferentiated. And so, in a sense, this and that, of course, is knowledge which arises in the state of union. For the Neoplatonists, it's the state of mystical union. And that seems to be very similar to what the result
Mm-hmm.
of ʿAṭṭār in this kind of process is. So those Neoplatonic. I mean, I hesitate about talking about Neoplatonism because I think it's there, but I'm not trying to reduce ʿAṭṭār to Neoplatonist, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that there is a tendency sometimes when we talk about Neoplatonism in a Sufi context to reduce it to that. I'm not making that point. I'm saying that the connections there are quite fascinating. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and just one more small comment about you know the love of God, or love of the one, which kind of invites hate. Do you think this is an explicitly Malamati theme, or is it? I mean, it's there clearly. That the opposite of love being to invite blame and hatred of the self.
I think the influence is clearly there, but it's at this point when it's gotten to ʿAṭṭār, it's gone through channels. Ahmed Ghazali, Ain al-Qadat, Ain al-Qazat. It's gone through. He's received this idea through other channels, but I do think, yes, that the origins of it seem to me to be from Malamatis who were had been in the area and definitely left their mark on what we call Sufism in Eastern Iran. But to your point, I almost wish we had in the study of Islam's intellectual history a word for like Ibn Sina as perceived versus Ibn Sina as he was, because the villain in, let's say, in ʔAṭṭār's works, because he actually explicitly mentions like Shifa and Najat. He explicitly mentions those works, but I don't know if he's actually read them, but he mentions them as not worthy of study. I mean, the villain of his is not the same person as the historical Ibn Sina when you read Ibn Sina, because Ibn Sina is not. I mean, there are points that Ibn Sina says that I think ʔAṭṭār certainly disagrees with. I think, like, for example, plainly the need for intelligence. That's the most obvious one. ʔAṭṭār doesn't. He does not. He's trying to explicitly tell us you do not need intelligence to know the real. But that aside, I mean, a there's a depiction of this, kind of what we call rationalizing philosopher that doesn't apply, I think, to Ibn Sina. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, it's that, but it's also, I mean, which, as you said, which have been seen. So um, the Ibn Sina of the Shifa and the Najat becomes kind of a cliche of a rational philosopher, who, privileges argument over everything else, right? But then, of course, you have the Avicenna of the other texts, and again, I mean, without being too polemical, this brings me back to Henri Corbin, right? So Corbin's book on Avicenna is not really about the Shifa and the Najat. It's Avicenna and the Visionary Recital. It's all about these kind of these allegories, and it's about like the Risale al-Tayr, and it's about the Mi'raj Nameh as well. So that's a very different kind of view that you get of someone like Avicenna. And I think what's quite clear is that there is a very mixed reception of Avicenna in the later period. So yes, you have the formal, philosophical works, whether it's the Shifa and the Isharat, but there's a lot more going on. And certainly for most of the later, I guess in your term, the later medieval thinkers, it's the whole of Avicenna that they're receiving, including the interest in the planetary spheres, including the reason why petitionary prayer works, including all sorts of considerations. Even there's this famous Risala, which is attributed to him on ziyarah, on pilgrimage, and most people find that a very problematic idea. But why not if you are looking at this sort of more holistic approach to Avicenna?
That's good. Thank you.
Let me open it up to others, and I should also at this point hand over to my colleague Ishtvan Krishnanoj, who's going to chair the discussion, just because we're coming up to Maghrib, so I need to away. But yes, Ishtvan, are you happy to take over? And yes, any questions, any comments, please do.
Is the recording still on, or you switched?
Oh yes. I need to stop it. Sorry, I completely forgot.
It's great that this part of the discussion is still on. I'm glad, but yeah.